When he saw the drops of blood on the snow, his heart froze, because he realized, this was no accident. Each morning, the old man made his slow, familiar trek through the silent pines to check the traps he'd set days before. The air was sharp and frosty, and his breath formed little clouds that drifted away like ghosts. He kept his eyes on the ground, scanning for the neat outlines of animal tracks. He expected the usual signs: rabbits, foxes, maybe a stray deer. What he did not expect was the dark stain that marred the pure white carpet of winter. At first, he thought it was a wounded deer. The drops were sparse, leading in a careful line between the trees. He followed them without thinking, cradling his old rifle across one arm. Every step crunched in the frozen hush. The blood glistened like rubies against the snow, and each footprint beside it sank deep, as if something heavy dragged itself forward. Then he saw the body. The wolf lay half buried in a drift, one foreleg twisted at an unnatural angle. Its coat, usually a tapestry of grays and browns, was matted and dark with blood. A rib jutted through torn flesh, and its breathing came in shallow gasps. The old man's pulse thundered in his ears. Instinct told him to keep his distance, to finish the job quickly before whatever creature had set the trap returned. But as he raised his rifle, he froze. The wolf did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. Instead, it looked at him with eyes so clear, so impossibly steady, that he felt a jolt run from his chest to his fingertips. It was a gaze that carried no fear, no malice, only a calm, unwavering plea. He lowered the rifle, his hands trembling. He wanted to turn away. But something about that gaze anchored him to the spot, as if the wolf already understood his next thought: I will kill you to end your suffering. He stepped closer, every muscle screaming in protest, yet drawn by compassion he didn't know he still possessed. The old man knelt in the snow, listening to his own breath and the wolf's ragged inhalations. He unshouldered his rifle, set it down gently on a fallen log, and knelt beside the animal. His fingers, stiff from the cold, pressed against the wolf's fur to find where the wound lay deepest. The wolf winced but did not flinch away. It clung to life with a dignity that stunned the old man. He tore a strip from his own scarf and bound the bloodied leg as best he could. Each knot he tied felt like a vow: I will not abandon you. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The wolf's breathing steadied, its muzzle quivered as though it wished to speak. The old man sensed it: this was more than pain. This was gratitude. He thought to himself, he looked at me as if I were one of his own, and in that instant, the line he'd drawn between man and beast vanished. He gathered the wolf in his arms, big, heavy, and warm, and carried it to his sled. The forest watched in silence, as if holding its breath. The wolf rested its head against the wood, its eyes never leaving the old man's face. He wrapped it in his coat and trudged home, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle he never asked for. When he reached his cabin, the wolf stirred with weak protest, but did not fight him. He laid it gently on the floor beside the hearth, where embers still glowed. He fetched clean rags and water, cleaned the wound, and applied a salve he'd once used on injured deer. All the while, the wolf lay silent, watching him with those impossible eyes. He thought, this is the end. He would do his duty, end the wolf's suffering quickly, and move on. But nature had a very different twist in store. As he finished tending the wound, the wolf lifted its head and licked his hand. Soft, deliberate, as if to say, thank you. He froze, overwhelmed by the gentle touch. He realized that in saving this creature, he had been the one who'd been saved, from loneliness, from the weight of regret that had pressed on him since his wife died. A spark of life flared in his chest, bright and alive. He stepped back and watched as the wolf struggled to sit. It lowered its head in a small nod before closing its eyes. The old man closed the cabin door against the wind and sat by the fire, listening to the wolf's breathing. He thought about walking away, but he knew he couldn't. He thought about finishing what he'd started, but he couldn't bring himself to raise that rifle again. He had come to end a life, and instead, he had become the keeper of a miracle. He wanted to leave. But something stopped him. As if the wolf already knew, he could not. He thought he would finish the wolf quickly so it would not suffer. But nature had prepared a very different turn of events. He loaded the wounded wolf onto the little wooden sled as if it were a sack of grain, not knowing whose life he was cradling in his arms. The sled's runners groaned under the weight as he hauled it through the drifts, each step an agony in his arthritic knees. Breath plumed from his nostrils in ragged clouds. He glanced back only once, expecting to see the animal surge up behind him, fierce and wild, but the wolf lay still, its flank rising and falling in shallow waves. He thought he could bring it inside, tend to it, and then end its misery swiftly. But he was wrong. Nature had already woven a different path. Inside the small cabin, he fashioned makeshift splints, 2 straight lengths of wood bound with strips torn from his own flannel shirt. By the light of a single kerosene lamp, he knelt beside the wolf and gently straightened the broken leg. Each motion elicited a quiet whine, but no attempt to bite or strike. He swallowed hard and reached for his needle and thread, wrapping coarse linen strips around flesh and splint alike. The wolf's breathing rattled in its throat, but its gaze remained fixed on the old man's hands. All night long, he sat by the hearth, refusing to sleep. He changed the bandages again and again, rinsed the wound with boiled water, and pressed antiseptic herbs into the gash. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the moon sailed silently through clouds. Once, a branch scraped the window so sharply that the wolf's ears pricked, yet it did not snap or growl. It simply listened, trusting the man who should have been its executioner. In the dim glow, the wolf raised its muzzle and sniffed at his outstretched hand. The old man froze, his heart hammering. Then, ever so gently, the wolf extended its tongue and licked his palm. He jerked his hand back as though burned, but the warmth of that touch lingered in his bones. If only I had known what that touch meant, he thought, voice breaking in the silent room. He gathered a bowl of boiled meat and held it to the wolf's lips. The animal ate only from his hand, chewing each morsel slowly, eyes never leaving his face. There was no scowl of feral hunger, no glitter of wild triumph, only a gentle acceptance, as if the wolf were saying, "You saved me. Now I belong to you, That look in its eyes," he whispered, leaning closer. There was no pain. There was only silence. Acceptance. Trust. He wanted to believe it was over. That he could radio a wildlife officer at dawn and walk away from this miracle he had stumbled into. But as the fire's light danced across the cabin walls, he realized that something irrevocable had shifted. He, the old loner, had become a guardian. And the wolf, this quiet, wounded creature, had become a companion. For days, he tended the wolf's injury. He fed it broth warmed by the hearth, stroked its fur when it whimpered, and spoke to it in a voice softer than any he had used in years. The wolf responded with a tilt of its head, a nudge of its cold nose against his woolen coat, as if to acknowledge each word. Neighbors, had they peeked through his frosted windows, would have thought him mad. To see a man nursing a wolf as though it were a lost hound, such a thing defied reason. But in the hush of that cabin, amid the scent of pine smoke and healing salve, reason no longer mattered. Only gratitude remained. Late one night, after a week of sleepless vigil, he found the wolf standing by the door. Its leg was still weak, but it moved with a caution that spoke of renewed strength. He reached out, and again, the wolf licked his hand, slow and deliberate. Tears welled in the old man's eyes. He crouched and whispered, "I thought I was saving you. But it's you who have saved me, from despair, from the emptiness I carried since she died. You've reminded me. I'm still alive. The wolf pressed its head against his palm, warm and steady. He closed his eyes and let the moment stretch. Outside, the storm rattled on, but inside, two souls stood bound by an unspoken promise. He would not abandon this creature. And the creature, in its silent way, would not abandon him. He packed fresh straw in a corner for the wolf to rest, then sat by the hearth, letting exhaustion pull him under. As he drifted into a troubled sleep, the image of that gentle lick remained, a symbol of hope, a reminder that compassion could cross even the deepest divides. If he had only known then what that touch meant, but perhaps some truths are only revealed in hindsight, when the heart is ready to believe in miracles. Each dawn, the old man crept to the edge of the forest with a small pile of fresh venison wrapped in cloth. He laid it on a flat stone beneath a lone pine, then stepped back into the clearing's pale light. The wolf waited just beyond the tree line, its good leg folded beneath it, body still lean but healing. It did not break its vigil to approach the meat. Instead, it watched him with steady eyes, as if weighing some unspoken question. For 3 days, this silent ritual repeated itself. The old man placed the food, then retreated to watch through frost-flecked windows. He wondered why the wolf refused the meal when its hunger must have been fierce. Yet every time he felt the pull to step forward and call it near, he hesitated, something in that patient gaze held him back. On the 4th morning, the wolf rose as the sun's first rays pierced the pines. Its leg no longer trembled. It stood tall, fur sleek and warm in the light. The old man dared hope, perhaps now the wolf would come inside, find comfort by the hearth, and repay his kindness with companionship. But the creature only sniffed the air, then slipped silently back into the shadows of the woods. He stood by the stump where he always placed the venison. No tracks led away from it. The meat lay untouched, as fresh as when he'd left it. A pang of something like sorrow stabbed him. Had he done too much? Had he nursed it back to strength only to watch it vanish into the wild once more? He tried not to show his disappointment. He stacked firewood, repaired a loose board on the cabin's porch, and swept the hearth. But his thoughts drifted to that empty clearing. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the wolf's silhouette melting into the gray-green tangle of pines. That night, a fierce wind rattled the shutters. Snow fell in fine, stinging needles. The old man lay awake on his narrow cot, listening to the howl of the storm. At first it seemed no different from any other winter's fury. Then, in the depths of the wind's roar, a single, clear howl rose, testimony of one lone wolf. His heart thundered. He leapt from his bed, grabbed his coat, and flung open the door. The world outside was a blur of flurries and ice. He stepped into the cold and called softly, "Here, friend. It's all right." But only the wind answered. Come morning, the clearing was pristine. No tracks marring the snow, no sign the wolf had ever been there. He searched in circles beyond the tree line, flashlight trembling in his hand. The forest felt vast and empty. He shouted the wolf's name as if it were his own child's, voice cracking with hope and fear. But his words dissolved into the whiteness. He returned home, shoulders slumped, head heavy. He thought, I thought this was the end. Thank you and farewell. But I was wrong. In the silence of his cabin, he realized the wolf had never belonged to him. It had only been visiting, leaving part of itself in that cool clearing, and carrying something of him back into the mystery. He pressed his fingers to his chest, where his heart still pounded from the night's vigil. A warmth lingered there, echoing the gentle strength of the beast he had saved. He carried on with his days, tending traps with a new reverence for every rustle in the underbrush. Occasionally, he would pause at the edge of the forest, half expecting to see that familiar shape emerging from the trees. But the pines remained motionless, the snow unbroken. And yet, each time he lit the hearth at dusk, he felt a presence at his back, a soft awareness that the wolf's spirit lingered in the smoke curling skyward. He placed fresh meat on the stone again, not out of hope for the animal's return, but as an offering to whatever had bound their fates together. He had thought the wolf would leave in gratitude. Instead, it vanished without saying goodbye. But I already felt, it had taken something of mine, my solitude, my regret, perhaps even my very heart, and carried it into the wild, where both of us would wait for the next turn in nature's story. Each morning, the old man slipped into his heavy coat and trudged through the frosted pines to the same clearing where he had laid out fresh venison. He moved with the deliberate caution of someone navigating both snow and memory, eyes fixed on the smooth stone at the forest's edge. But each dawn the stone lay bare, the meat untouched, and there was no sign of the wolf that had once lain there. He stood in the pale light, shoulders bowed by cold and expectation, and simply waited until the chill drove him home. When the snows melted, he returned in sturdy boots, skirted by fresh ferns and wildflowers. Summer days found him there at dusk, the air thick with mosquitoes and bird song. He left small offerings of meat or fish on the stone, then backed away, heart thrumming with longing. But the clearing remained empty, silent as a dream forgotten at sunrise. Autumn came and painted the woods in fiery oranges and reds. He walked among rustling leaves, following the same path he had carved in snow. Each step was a plea, please come back, please remember. But the forest gave only the rustle of wind and the snap of twig underfoot. At night, he began to hear it again, a distant howl, carried on the cold breeze. It rose and fell like a question, haunting and beautiful. He would press his ear to the cabin wall, listening until the sound faded into the dark. Was it the wolf he had saved, calling from the wild? Or merely the echo of his own yearning? One evening, as he closed the heavy door behind him, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. No deer tracks led up to the porch, no fox or raccoon prints marred the soft earth. The small thieves that once scavenged his scraps had vanished. A hush hung over the clearing, as if invisible sentinels patrolled the perimeter. He frowned and brushed snow from the steps, unsettled by the absence of these ordinary visitors. Something was guarding his home. For the first time, he realized that the wolf's departure might not have been a final, casual goodbye. Then I thought for the first time, maybe he did not leave by chance, he admitted to himself, voice low in the empty silence. He carried on with his daily tasks, mending fences, chopping firewood, checking old traps for anything he could release rather than kill. Yet in every quiet moment, he felt watched. He would pause mid-swing and glance toward the tree line, expecting to see that familiar shape. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He imagined the wolf standing sentinel beyond the pines, an unbroken circle of protection laid around the cabin and its solitary keeper. The thought both thrilled and frightened him. He, who had believed himself master of this place, now realized he was guest under the wolf's silent oath. One crisp morning, he found fresh paw prints pressed into the dew-slick earth around his porch, too large and too precise to be any common animal. They formed a neat semicircle, as if the wolf had walked a patrol and returned into the woods without disturbing a blade of grass. He traced the prints with his fingers, heart pounding. His breath caught. He should have been alone. But the wolf had returned in spirit at least, marking the boundary of his domain. He felt a surge of gratitude and awe, and a tremor of fear. He shook his head and squared his shoulders. I thought this was the end. But I was wrong, nature had only hushed its voice for a time. That evening, he sat by the fire and stared into the flames. The crackle of burning pine seemed to whisper the wolf's name. He sensed a presence in the shadows, a warmth that was neither human nor cold. The embers glowed like distant eyes, watching. He closed his eyes and let the memory flood back, the gentle lick on his palm, the steady gaze that bridged two worlds. In that moment, he understood that his life and the wolf's were forever entwined. He would leave out meat in every season, not out of hope for a return, but as a gesture of respect to the guardian of his solitude. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf answered with a howl that shook the night. The old man pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the familiar ache of wonder. He was no longer a mere trapper in an empty forest. He was the keeper of a promise. And though the clearing stood empty beneath the waning moon, he knew the wolf's spirit walked those shadows still, defending him, guiding him. He did not know when or if he would see the creature again. But he was content to wait, guarded by gratitude that needed no words, and by a bond that death itself could never break. When the first snowflake of the great storm fell, his heart froze, because he realized, this day was meant for more than survival. A year had passed since the old man had nursed the wolf back from death. In that time, the cabin had become a place of quiet vigil. He never forgot the creature that had saved him as much as he had saved it. On this morning, exactly 365 days after that fateful rescue, the sky darkened with swollen clouds. By midday, the wind tore at the pines, and a blizzard descended, whipping snow into drifts that swallowed the world in white. All day, he stoked the fire and listened to the storm's howl as it battered his small home. He felt the old ache in his bones, the same ache that had driven him into the forest that first morning. Yet tonight, beneath that furious sky, something deeper stirred in his chest. He sensed a returning presence. As darkness fell, the wind's roar shifted into a chorus of low, urgent howls. At first, they seemed distant, ghostly echoes carried over miles of frozen wilderness. But with each passing minute, the pack's voices edged closer, rising in a relentless wave that rattled the shutters and shook the door. The old man's breath came fast. He wrapped his thick coat tight, then grabbed his lantern and stepped into the swirling night. The lantern's glow hardly pierced the storm, its flame bobbed wildly, casting long, trembling shadows across the snow. He stumbled down the narrow path to the clearing where he had tended the wolf's wounds. His boots sank into the drifts, each step a labor in the biting wind. His lantern illuminated nothing but swirling white, until he reached the lip of the forest. There, at the tree line, stood silhouettes, dozens of them, silent and still. The storm obscured their fur and features, but their shapes were unmistakable, wolves, assembled in a perfect circle around the edge of the clearing. He halted, lantern held high, eyes wide as the wind whipped around him. "I thought, it was a dream," he whispered, voice lost in the storm. I blinked, and they did not disappear. His legs trembled. He wanted to turn and run, but awe rooted him to the spot. The wolves did not shift or stir, though their ears flickered with life. They watched him as a single being, collectively waiting, as though summoned by an unspoken bond. Then he saw him, the wolf he had saved. He stood at the very front of the circle, coat dusted with snow, his fine features carved in pale light. His eyes shone with a depth of understanding that stilled the old man's racing heart. Slowly, deliberately, the wolf raised his head and nodded. The old man dropped to his knees. The lantern slipped from his hand, its glass shattering on the snow, but he scarcely noticed. A single tear froze on his cheek as the storm's fury faded into a hush around them. In that silence, he felt the power of a promise kept, the wolf's silent thanks carried on the wind. He thought back to that first morning, when he had almost turned away. He remembered the gentle lick that had bridged their worlds, and the quiet nights spent nursing pain into healing. Now, as he knelt before the pack, he understood the true depth of their gratitude. No howl followed the nod. Instead, the wolves turned as one and slipped back into the pines, disappearing into the storm as though they had never been there. The old man remained on his knees, staring after them until the last shadow receded. He rose slowly, spine stiff with cold, and brushed the snow from his coat. He retrieved his lantern from the snowbank, the broken glass glinting like a fallen star. Cradling it, he whispered into the roaring wind, "Thank you, for everything." Inside the cabin, he warmed his hands by the hearth and stared into the dancing flames. His heart pounded with wonder and reverence. He knew the wolves had come to honor him, to repay the debt of life. And though they would never return that night, their presence lingered in the hush of the house. He pressed his palm to his chest, where the memory of the wolf's nod still glowed. "He stood first," he murmured, voice thick, "as if to thank me." That midnight, the storm raged on, but the old man slept soundly for the first time in a year, his dreams filled with silver pines, gentle eyes, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the wild. He stood frozen at the forest's edge, lantern dangling in his trembling hand, every nerve alive with the electric charge of that midnight visitation. The wind had died to a hush, and the blizzard's fury gave way to drifting motes of snow illuminated by the lantern's weak glow. The old man, once a seasoned ranger who had weathered storms and faced down predators, now felt the unsteady knees of a frightened boy. Before him, the wolves lingered in perfect stillness. 7 sleek forms, jaws softly closed, coats flecked with snow. They watched as one, no hostile snarl, no restless pacing, only a quiet, intense presence that pressed into his bones. His breath hitched. He felt the weight of every gaze upon him. He swallowed, eyes wide, remembering the day he had tended the broken leg of the lone wolf. The memory of that gentle lick, the resignation in those eyes, came flooding back. Now, here they were, not one, but an entire pack, as if drawn by that same thread of gratitude. His heart thundered in his chest. He wanted to flee, to slam the cabin door and pretend none of this had happened. But he knew he could not turn away. Compelled by something deeper than logic, he took a tiny step forward, careful and reverent. The wolves held their ground. They did not flinch or circle, they simply watched the old man's approach. Each footfall crunched in the fresh snow. His lantern cast long shadows, and in those shadows he saw not beasts but sentinels marking sacred ground. He stopped when he was only a few yards from the bravest wolf, the one who had returned to thank him a year before. That wolf did not bow or lower his head. Instead, he met the old man's gaze with the same unwavering calm. The others formed a silent chorus of witness behind him. Time slowed. The old ranger closed his eyes and drew a shuddering breath. He thought of the nights spent nursing pain into healing, of the silent pact he had forged without words, when compassion bridged the gulf between human and wild. He raised his chin and nodded. Slowly, deliberately, the alpha wolf inclined his head in return, a gesture of respect and farewell. The old man's throat tightened. A single tear slid down his weathered cheek, freezing on contact with his whiskering stubble. "They came not for meat," he whispered to the empty hush, voice thick with wonder. "They came, for me." At his words, the wolves stirred as one. Without a sound, they turned and melted back into the forest's edge, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark trees. The wind sighed through the pines, stirring the snow into a gentle drift. The old man remained where he stood, lantern still aloft, until the last shape vanished. Then he lowered the light, the broken glass clinking softly as he shut it off. He stood in the absolute blackness, feeling the resonance of those 7 pairs of eyes still burning in his memory. He touched his chest, where the wolf's nod had engraved an invisible mark upon his heart. His body trembled, not with fear now, but with profound gratitude. He pressed a hand to his lips and exhaled, a breath that tasted of snow and awe. Inside the cabin, he stoked the fire and let the warmth flood the hearth. He set his lantern on the table, untouched, as though it, too, bore witness to the miracle. His hands shook as he poured a measure of whiskey into a chipped glass and raised it in silent toast. "To my friends," he murmured, voice gentle. "May our paths cross again." He sat by the glowing embers, listening to the wood crackle, the only sound after the wolves' departure. In the emptiness, he felt no loneliness, only a serene companionship that had outlasted time and distance. He thought of the pack patrolling his cabin's perimeter all those months, of the offering of meat that remained untouched, of the distant howls that haunted his nights. Each memory glowed like a star in his mind. He knew the forest held its secrets close, but tonight it had revealed one: the bond between man and wild was unbreakable. As he drifted to sleep, the embers smoldering low in the hearth, he carried the image of those silent wolves etched upon his soul. 7 guardians who had come not for food, but to honor a promise. 7 pairs of eyes. And only one gaze he recognized, the one that had changed his life forever. He sat by the frost-lined window long after the fire had died to embers, watching the stars pale and the sky turn the color of old tin. Sleep eluded him, despite the ache in his joints and the soft howl of the morning wind. His cabin, once a refuge of solitude, now felt charged with memories that would not release him. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the rafters echoed the silent presence of those wolves, their unspoken ritual replaying in his mind. He remembered the nod at the forest's edge, the nod that had carried the weight of gratitude and recognition. He recalled the 7 shapes shimmering in the storm, standing guard like ancient sentinels. He felt the tremor in his own hands when he had dared to step forward, and the hush that followed when they melted back into the woods. It had been more than a visit. It had been an initiation, a sacred rite that bridged the gulf between man and nature. His eyes traced the patterns of frost on the glass as dawn's pale promise stretched across the sky. He thought of the offerings of meat he had left through every season, offerings never taken, yet always there. He thought of the night when no other creatures dared come close, as though some invisible sentry patrolled his land. His heart squeezed at the memory. When the first light tipped the pines in silver, he rose and dressed in his thickest coat and boots. He moved deliberately, as though each action were part of a silent liturgy. He stepped outside into the freshly fallen snow, breath-forming icy clouds around him. The world was still and hushed, as if the forest itself was waiting. He walked around the cabin, each step leaving a new impression in the virgin drifts. Then he saw them, dozens of paw prints forming a perfect circle around the house. Large, precise, unwavering. The wolves had circled his home in the dead of night, leaving their marks like a wreath of protection laid at the threshold of his life. For a moment, he stood frozen, the crisp air catching in his throat. He bent to examine the prints, running a gloved finger along the edge of one. The pattern was unmistakable, pads and claws pressed deep into the snow, each print evenly spaced, each circle closing where it began. A guard of honor drawn around his sanctuary. He straightened and pressed a hand to his chest, where his heart pounded against bone. He thought, I once believed the wolf's departure was the end. I thought it was simply a random gesture. But my heart knew otherwise. He felt a swell of emotion, astonishment, gratitude, awe, all at once. The loneliness that had once defined every corner of this cabin melted away like frost in the morning sun. He realized, with a jolt of recognition, that he was not alone. That for every lonely footstep he had taken in the woods, there had been steel-gray eyes watching, waiting, honoring him. He stepped back inside, closing the door gently against the wind. He warmed his stiff fingers by the hearth and poured himself a measure of coffee in a chipped tin mug. Steam curled upward, and he brought the mug to his lips, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. He felt tethered now, to the land, to the forest, to the unseen pack whose presence had transformed his life. He moved to the workbench and lifted the small wooden sled he had used to carry the injured wolf. He traced a hand over the worn runners, recalling their groan under weight and their slide across the snow. He thought of the blood-stained fur, of the labored breaths, of the trust in those pale eyes. He thought of how a single act of compassion had rippled outward, drawing a circle of guardians around him. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying a voice he could almost hear. You are one of us. He closed his eyes and nodded. He felt the truth settle in his bones like a benediction. He spent the rest of the morning clearing a wide path around the cabin's perimeter, brushing the snow to reveal the wolves' circle. He stood in its center and looked outward at the bare trees, feeling their silent watch. He raised his mug in salute. To the wild ones, he whispered. To the bonds that never break. He carried the mug back to the hearth and set it down. Then he fetched a handful of dried venison from a hook in the wall and, with deliberate care, scattered it in a rough ring on the porch, an offering not for hunger, but for respect. He stepped back and watched, though he knew the meat would remain untouched, the gesture mattered more than the result. As he stood there, the forest seemed to exhale. The wind carried the softest echo of a distant howl, distant but unmistakable. He pressed a hand to his heart and closed his eyes, feeling the echo resonate within him. For the first time in decades, he felt a peace deeper than any he had known, a peace born of kinship with the wild. He was no longer just an old man in a lonely cabin. He was part of something larger, a circle of life, a covenant of respect, a promise written in paw prints upon the snow. And as the winter sun climbed higher, he knew that whatever came next, he would never walk alone again. When the first chill of winter crept into the cabin, the old man knew it was time to return to the clearing one last time. He filled a worn cloth sack with venison strips and trudged through the frosted pines, each breath a plume of mist in the dawn light. The world was hushed under a pale blanket of snow, as if holding its breath. He laid the meat upon the flat stone at the forest's edge, stepped back, and watched until the last trace of warmth faded from his vision. He never saw the wolves again. Not the lone gray sentinel, nor the pack that had come to his lantern's glow a year ago. Seasons turned on their quiet axis, winter softened into spring, spring yielded to summer, and summer burned into autumn, yet the clearing remained empty, a silent stage for memories rather than miracles. Every winter, without fail, the old man made the pilgrimage. He carried meat in the folds of his coat, dusted snow from its surface, and laid it upon the stone. He waited with the stillness of one who communes with absence, listening for the soft padding of paws that never came. When the forest offered only its wind chimes of ice and the hush of falling snow, he would turn away with a heart full of longing. Each spring, he returned to find the meat gone. Not scavenged by fox or raven, but vanished as if claimed by unseen hands. The ragged cloth sack lay empty, its contents spirited away in the night. He pressed his palm to the stone and felt its cold smoothness, marveling at the proof of their passage. He never spoke of these visits to neighbors or wandering hikers. The cabin's windows framed his solitude like a painting. Rumor whispered of the hermit who left offerings to ghosts, but he paid them no mind. His ritual was private, a lone prayer of gratitude echoing in the hush of pines. One evening, as he sat by the hearth, embers crackling at his feet, he ran his calloused fingers over the scarred wood of the sled. Memory unspooled, the weight of the broken wolf, its rib pressed against the sled's curved runners, the scent of pines mixed with blood, the warmth of its breath against his coat. He closed his eyes and heard the distant echo of a wolf's howl, distant yet familiar, carrying the promise of a bond unbroken by time or distance. He opened his eyes and looked into the dying fire. His heart ached with longing and joy entwined. He realized then, with a clarity that glowed hotter than the embers, what those visits had meant. They had not come for food. They had not come for mercy. They had come to say, "We remember." A tremor passed through him, equal parts sorrow that they had drifted back into legend and wonder that their spirits still reached him. He stood and crossed to the window, pressing his forehead to the cold pane. Outside, snow drifted in silent spirals. The forest stood motionless, but he felt its heartbeat. He sank onto the rough-hewn bench beside the hearth and drew a deep, shuddering breath. His chest tightened as if the very memory of that nodding wolf had left an imprint upon his ribs. He let his gaze drift to the brass hook on the wall, where he kept the photograph he had found in his late wife's old trunk. He reached for it with trembling fingers. The black and white image showed a younger version of himself, smiling beside a wounded wolf lying on a bed of straw. At the center of the photograph, faint but unmistakable, was a crescent-shaped gouge, an impression of a claw right over the man's heart. His heart lurched at the sight, and he felt a warmth bloom beneath his palm. He cradled the photo in his hand and whispered, "I don't know how it ended up there. But he knew where my heart was. And it is now with them." A tear ran down his cheek and splintered on his beard like a frozen raindrop. He set the photograph beside his pipe and sat back, letting silence fill the cabin. The crackle of the hearth was the only sound, yet in that silence he heard the echo of paws on snow, the soft chorus of grateful howls. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. His old bones ached not with age, but with the weight of memories that glowed brighter than any fire. He closed his eyes and felt their presence surround him, guardians of his solitude, witnesses to his compassion. He rose and stood before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. "If someone had told me this story," he murmured to the empty room, voice gentle as falling snow, "I would have never believed it. But I saw it with my own eyes." He exhaled, and the words filled the cabin like a benediction. He sank onto the bench again, content to watch the embers fade into black. A soft smile curved his lips as he thought of the wolves circling his home in the dead of night, leaving their paw prints like a wreath of protection. He reached for his pen and notebook, opened a fresh page, and scrawled a final line, *, "They came not for food. They came to say, we remember, *. Then he closed the lid and set it aside, certain that some truths are best held in the heart rather than on paper. He remained there until sleep claimed him, wrapped in the warmth of the hearth and the echo of those silent guardians. Outside, the snow fell undisturbed, sealing the clearing in a gentle hush. If your heart is racing now, you understand. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the truth that nature remembers. If you too believe that animals remember kindness, write in the comments, "We are not alone in this world."